Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this very important panel on resilience. With all the challenges that we are faced with globally, I think it should be common sense to invest and build resilience. Unfortunately, common sense is not always that common, but let's see now during this panel if we can all be persuaded to strengthen resilience and what is the smart way to do this. We know that resilience is not for free either, so one has to invest. And I think the report that McKinsey and the World Economic Forum presented yesterday shows that unlocking investments also with working with multilateral banks and other financial institutions is also very, very important. I think that when it comes to resilience and investing in it, I would say that the cost of inaction usually far exceeds the cost of action if it's done in the right way. So let us start with you, Bob Sternfeld, managing partner of McKinsey. I guess I don't need to persuade you on the importance of investing in resilience. We have built this resilience consortium together during the last year. So let's kick off with you, Bob.
Super. Well, thanks, Jorge. It's great being here and being with some co-collaborators now for a few years on this notion of resilience. And when we got together with the World Economic Forum 3 years ago to talk about this, I think both of us were unsure if this was going to be an enduring topic or a response at the time to a real dislocation in terms of the pandemic. And then you had the invasion of Ukraine, and we saw that supply chains weren't as resilient as we thought they should be. We've had geopolitics change around us, and I think we're all building conviction that this might be a topic and a capability that is here to stay, and one that we need to do more to foster, to solve some of the toughest problems. So I'm more and more excited every year. This is our third year doing this together, that this is something, resilience is something we need to lean into. And I might just offer a few reflections from this year's report, just to get us started on this topic. And I'll start maybe with a concern. So we surveyed over 250 institutions, and most folks aren't prepared. Most folks aren't doing enough in the topic of resilience, whether it's private enterprise or public institutions. In fact, 84% of respondents said they don't think they're investing enough in resilience. And that should be a call to action of can we do more? So I'd start with the notion of perhaps underinvestment. When you then do look at investment, the group biased much more to short-term tactical things than some of the medium-term strategic and more fundamental things. And they called that out as a concern of how do I actually start to invest more fundamentally in the longer-term aspects of resilience as opposed to the tactics. And those are things like thinking in advance about how to respond collaboratively to crises. Are we pre-allocating and pre-wiring? Strategic reorientation, and how do we think about the strategic topic? And I know you and I have spoken often about this notion, the notion of foresight and the notion of preparedness. These are more of the long-term things that I think there was a call out in our report to do more on. There's also one that I'm personally passionate about, which is this notion of resilience as a skill. In fact, sometimes we talk about it as a muscle that needs to be built, and unless you keep that muscle in shape, can atrophy. And there was a highlight that there's more we can do both at the enterprise level. How do we think about the organizations that we lead being rewired to be more resilient, but also at the individual level? And one of the fascinating conversations is what share of mind for people who are in senior HR roles is dedicated to building the personal skill of resilience? How do you help leaders be more resilient at an individual level? And we highlighted that's one of the underinvested areas just at a personal skill level. So that's a bit of a call out. We call out the notion of this public-private interface, and I know we'll talk more about this, but the notion, and this has been an enduring theme at the World Economic Forum for a while, but when it particularly comes to resilience, resilience cannot be solved in isolation. Resilience requires collaboration. And there are some stress points in how to actually collaborate across this. And so there was a call out there. And I know those are areas of perhaps concern and where to invest more. I'll flip it around to then the glass half full side of what are some of the problems that can be addressed by being more resilient. And this was, I think, one of the exciting parts of our report. You know, we looked at furthering macroeconomic stability, something that's absolutely critical in this world. There's a tie to being more resilient, driving more stability macroeconomically. Stable investments over longer periods of time. The more resilient, the more confident you get about making bold investments over long time frames. So there's an aspect of unleashing capital flows. Equipping workforce with the skills of the future. You know, and I know one of the big topics here is the rapid change in technology, et cetera, but investing in resilience gives us more confidence about reskilling the workforce. And maybe finally, this notion of being better prepared and mitigating the costs of future unforeseen crises. So I lead that to maybe the positive aspects here, Borge, of where our report together pointed to.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's a nice segue on the macroeconomic stability and also future growth potential and how to unlock that in emerging markets. To Gita Gopinath, First Deputy Managing Director at IMF. So, Gita, what will it take to not only get back to trend growth globally, but also to sustain the growth in the emerging markets?
Yes, thank you, Borge. So firstly, I just want to echo a point that Bob made in terms of resilience, which is having strong macro stability in your economy. And I do want to point out, and this is a positive note, that emerging markets did well in the last few years. You know, in the past, if you had the US Federal Reserve increasing interest rates by 450 basis points, if you had a pandemic, if you had a big increase in energy prices, we would have expected much more emerging market turmoil. And we did as an institution, because that's our job at the IMF. And I remember numerous meetings where we sat and we were building scenarios of what could go wrong. And that didn't happen. But that required, as you said, long-term investment, which is, you know, starting from the 1990s, there was a much more careful switch to sound monetary policy frameworks, financial sector regulation, ensuring that you're not borrowing too much in foreign currency. All of that is what provides resilience. So that's a good example. Now, that's good news. Now, looking ahead, of course, there continue to be very important headwinds for emerging markets. You know, we're in an environment where borrowing costs are likely to be much higher for longer. The US dollar is stronger and has gone up quite a bit in the last few months. And you know, trade policy is going to require adapting to as it's changing. So there are plenty more knocks in terms of what emerging markets will have to deal with, and they'll have to build resilience to it. But I think what is critical is also to note that there has been a secular decline in GDP per capita growth in emerging and developing emerging markets. So if you look at the start of the 2000s, the per capita growth was around 3.6%. And since the pandemic, it's been halved to 1.8%. And what's behind that is both that productivity growth has slowed, and also private sector investment has slowed, with important exceptions like Saudi Arabia and Mexico and a few other countries. But more generally, you've seen a decline. And so changing that environment, and this is what I'll end with, which is what emerging markets need to reinvest in, is in structural reforms, which has slowed quite a bit since the early 2000s, the intensity of doing those reforms. So building those reforms, continue to build deep capital markets, ease of doing business, encouraging innovation in the private sector. Returning to that is, I think, the best way to build resilience to the headwinds that these countries face.
Thank you. Very interesting. The need for structural reforms. Of course, we see some markets like Argentina going through very tough structural reforms. But it's interesting that you also said that productivity has not increased as much post-COVID as before. And that is in a situation where we are expecting big productivity gains from Gen AI and the new technologies. Is that slower in the emerging markets? One question. And the second, we know that there is more debt out there now globally than at any other point since the Second World War. Does that apply for emerging markets too? And how much concerned are you about debt now being the biggest expense, the biggest cost in many state budgets?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of productivity growth, actually, with some very few exceptions like the US, in terms of productivity growth since the pandemic, most other parts of the world, productivity growth has disappointed, including in Europe, including in China, including in most emerging and developing countries. So this is not at this point about whether they're able to adopt the new technologies and AI and incorporate. Pretty much all countries in the world have a problem to deal with there. In terms of the debt, yes, that is one of the biggest issues that we are concerned about, which is debt levels are at, public sector debt was $100 trillion now, and it is projected to reach 100% of world GDP by the end of this decade. And also, just so that you're not too complacent, there is an optimism bias in these forecasts, and usually debt tends to end up being 10 percentage points higher than what we forecast. So we just have to just keep in mind that this is a serious issue for countries to deal with, which is why, in terms of the needed investment that countries will require to build resilience, including to deal with climate change and to deal with the digital transformation and AI, it has to come from the private sector. I mean, 80 to 90% of the climate finance will have to come from the private sector. So, countries will have to invest in the ecosystem that will encourage private investment.
Thank you. Turning to you, Excellency, Minister of Finance from Saudi Arabia, Al-Jadaan. I guess that resilience is also something that is on the top of the agenda in the Saudi cabinet. But of course, a lot of responsibilities, as usual, on Minister of Finance, because there is a big responsibility on keeping the macroeconomics right. Good growth projections from IMF for the kingdom in its last outlook, but I guess that doesn't make you complacent.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think the possibly serious risk is getting complacent. So we need to be very careful. For you to be resilient is not to get complacent. And I agree really with what I said earlier. I would add two things, possibly. One is, for any country, and particularly if we'll talk about Saudi Arabia as an emerging economy, it is very difficult to invoke and serious reforms, but these reforms are the key anchor of being resilient. And we have seen that, for Saudi Vision 2030 laid the ground for very serious reforms that are needed for any country to be resilient. And then it's not just starting the reform, announcing a reform, it's really committing to actually executing these reforms. And doubling down on successes and making sure that you also look at what you have done and adjust through the course of implementation. Fiscal reforms are absolutely necessary. And we started, for example, in 2017, what we now call the EXPRO, which is the Government Expenditure and Projects Efficiency, which yielded an incredible results. I mean, we have put a target on management to give us a return on investment of about $100 to each dollar we allocate to them as a budget. And they came back with about $200 for each dollar. So I would encourage actually every country around the world invest in efficiency, government efficiency. It yields, and it yields very good results. At the same time, they are not allowed actually to touch targets. So they are unable to change strategies and targets and objectives. They are only able to make it more efficient. So that is one. Second is making sure that you have also very strong institutions. Institutions within the government and then collaborating with the private sector is absolutely key. I mean, we have seen that as a result of that, between 17 and 24, private investments as percentage of GDP have grown by about 54%, actually more than that. And that is a structural change. It's not easy to change private investment as part of a GDP. So it's a serious structural change that is moving and bringing confidence. 3, you need to be very careful not to go after KPIs and rankings and whatever, because a lot of the resilience initiatives that you need to take within your economy will not show in your GDP growth, will not show some of the basic even expenditure returns, but it shows during tough times. So you need to make sure that you are aware that you will be investing and knowing that it will not pay off next quarter and next year. It will pay when you really need it. And that's what happened in Saudi. We went through COVID, possibly one of the best economies performing during COVID was Saudi Arabia. We spent less than half of what the world average have spent for COVID. And actually, our economy shrank less than half of the average global economy. And then we rebounded very quickly the following year. So it pays.
And how did you manage that?
I think you manage it with government alignment, working with the private sector and making sure that actually you have a very clear vision that is well communicated, with very clear leadership commitment, with long-term plans, which I think a lot of the world now suffering from short-term planning and not being able to make tough decisions. In Saudi Arabia, actually, we communicated very well. We mobilized the whole nation behind this vision, and people are excited. You mobilize, we have a youth nation that we focused on and make sure that human capital is in the center of this. When you mobilize that nation with a very clear vision, actually you will get a lot of positive outcome.
Thank you. I'm turning to Odier Renaud-Bassot, President of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In the report that was presented yesterday, the role of the MDBs and the role of the multilateral banks when it comes to also supporting investments in emerging markets is strongly underlined. Of course, there is a lot of players that want the capital that is available. So what is your strategy for using your resources in the most strategic way in emerging markets in the years to come?
So, first of all, I would like to start by, sorry, my voice is a bit, to start by the concept of resilience, because I think it's extremely relevant, and I very much agree with what you just said, which is, I mean, there have been a succession of shocks. What I think we learn from that is the need to build resilience, and for me, to build resilience is being able to think about the long term. So not, I mean, and we cannot cover all strategies and so forth, but being, I mean, able to anticipate that there may be shocks and have the agility and the preparedness to be ready for that. And I think one of the challenges for the emerging market, there have been very resilient. Some countries have been, I was thinking about resilience and I was thinking about Ukraine, you know, as a, country with a huge, which has shown huge resilience. But one of the challenges for the emerging market is that to build resilience, you need to invest. And capital is a big issue. And the lack of homegrown capital or weakness of the homegrown capital is a major challenge in a number of countries, which needs to be addressed, but also the reliance and the volatility of external capital. So I think that's where MDBs can play an important role. But I believe that we cannot substitute. So what we can do is in my view, two sort of things. The first thing is really to work with the country on developing, all together with the IMF and with other MDBs as a system, the relevant policies that will facilitate, resilience and develop capital, homegrown capital and capital market and attract investment. And this is a macroeconomic policy framework and the credibility of the macroeconomic policy framework. It's also a framework which is conducive to private investor, rule of law, regulatory framework, simplification, and so forth. And what we see is a tendency, like maybe a contradiction in all this debate about resilience, where it could call for more state involvement, more top-down public policy making, and so forth. And we see a tendency of having states coming back more, lack of willingness to go for privatization, sort of, it depends on country, of course, but this is one of the challenges. I think that to build resilience, and you need to really work with the private sector, because you are not going to sort out all the issues through public sector, government, or state-owned enterprise. And so the first pillar of our activity is really developing these policies which are conducive for investment and attracting private investment. The second pillar is, of course, very important, and is the mostly known and visible is the financing, and the fact that our financing is related to a very thorough work on project preparation, so helping building a pipeline, designing projects which are, hopefully will bring confidence from the private sector to share with us the investment, to invest alongside us, or to, they multiply our own investment. The second thing is that this investment and the track record we have in terms of loss or limited loss is also a way to build confidence. And we have been working with other MDBs on publishing the data of our the default on our lending activity, and giving more transparency to the outcome of this data, in order to, because that's a key element, I think, to better appreciate the risk. There is often, a perception that emerging market risk is too risky for private investors, for pension funds, for asset managers, and so forth. And there is a tendency to see that as a whole category without differentiation. So I think giving more data, more granularity, and so forth is one very important element of. And the last point we are trying to do is really to develop tools where we can bring more private sector together with us, so or share the risk. We are, our pipeline of projects and so forth with private investors, mobilization of the private sector.
As you mentioned, Odea, this notion of resilience is, and investing in resilience is important, but sometimes it doesn't come on the top of the priority agenda. How can you incentivize also in your work that these projects are financed, even if they're maybe not on the top of the agenda? Maybe new industry policies are on top of the agenda and not resilience. Can you lean in, and do you lean in on those things?
Yes, I think what we can bring is this long-term perspective. So, helping countries to look into not only the short term, the next year or the year after, but what will be the challenges in the long term. And the climate issue is one of the most, acute and obvious issue on which this long-term financing is absolutely needed, because also you need to think about the strategy of a country, not only in the public sector, but in manufacturing, in housing. So it's a very complex, and all the tools which have been developed to have these long-term strategies are very relevant to help addressing that. What we can do is advising and developing the scenarios and the data that help taking the decision. We cannot substitute the decision. But.
So, Jakob Orup Andersen, CEO of Carlsberg. It's good to have a strong voice also from the private sector. How much do you walk the talk on the resilience building in your company?
So thanks, Bora. Let me offer a company perspective because I think it's in the end that's where a lot of this ends as well. It's a massive thing for us as a company. We're multinational, and you can say what we've experienced over the last 178 years of operations is that it's not the crisis that gradually builds that is the biggest shock to the system. It's the unknowns, and that's where you see resilience in your organization or not. And when I look at, and we've had our fair bit as a company as well. If I look at it from my lens, I think there are basically 3 aspects of resilience. And the first one is, you can say, structural enterprise resilience. So, and that's something you can do in peacetime, if I may use that term. So it's for us, if you look at our company as an example, we view structural enterprise resilience through the lens of being in 150 countries. Having 140 brand families, which means you structurally construct a company that is resilient to certain shocks. It's also in how we structure the organization. We're very focused on making sure that we have decision-making powers that empower at the right level in the organization for people to make fast decisions. Also that we can segregate risks across the organization in a structural way. So it's really how do you create the organizational mechanisms that guarantees that the organism called the company reacts structurally the moment it gets a shock. The second element for me is cultural and leadership resilience, and Bob was touching on leadership, which I think is incredibly important. And it's not my leadership; it's the broad leadership. Don't worry. When I look at culture as part of that, it's very much around. Everyone would immediately say, okay, that's then grit and perseverance and in resilience. I actually think we have that, but it's also another element. It's around how do you create an open culture, so a trusting, safe culture where you set up systems of empowerment and a culture that is a learn-it-all culture where people are willing to raise their hand very early. Because what is the key to contain a crisis? It's early detection and reaction. So you need a culture where people are not afraid to say, listen, something looks wrong. And you also need a culture where they feel empowered to move. The other element around the culture is leadership. We talked about it in a number of also across this table. And I think in leadership, it's also how do you create, because of course you can hire people that are born with resilience. That's great, but we don't have that DNA scanning machine. So from a leadership perspective, it's also how do we take our leaders on the journey in the company that ensures that they've been exposed to different markets, different functions, they've seen very different situations, so when they get hit by a curveball, they can act with true resilience. And one of those aspects is you cannot get to a certain senior level in the organization without having worked in more than one market. So you need those lenses. The third element is strategic resilience. And here we operate very openly with what we call the what-if scenarios. So all of our known risk areas, we operate with what-if scenarios where we work on the range of outcomes in a given situation. And then we build strategic optionality in the company around those potential outcomes. That also means we will build strategic optionality in the company that will never be used. But it's a key term for us, that strategic optionality, because we need to have thought through all the known unknowns. If you do that, to take a phrase from you, Bob, if that's okay, a resilient company can then play defense and offense at the same time. For us, I think Ukraine was mentioned. Ukraine is a good example. We're the biggest brewer in Ukraine, 3 major breweries, a lot of employees. Of course, it's been all about defense in terms of protecting the health and safety of our people. But at the same time, we also chose, because of the resilience in the system, to go on the offensive in terms of making one of the biggest private sector investments in Ukraine during the war by doubling our Kiev capacity and taking a risk. But we did it because of the resilience in the system. And I think that is the key point I would end with, which is we talk resilience. It's not just a defensive thing. True resilience is also building your organization so you can be courageous and take the right risks as well. So let's not make it a defensive conversation. It's as much a courageous offensive conversation.
And I really a lot of food for thoughts in those 3 points. I think we can all learn from that. I took note, even at the
Let me
World.
know if you need more.
Yeah. Well, we might invite you to one of our internal meetings at the World Economic Forum too, you know. But I was thinking about what you were saying, that also dealing and preparing people for dealing with the unknowns, and that is really building a muscle.
Yes.
Internally, and exposing people to different markets, different challenges before they get the really important leadership positions. Because that's the way to test if the resilience is there, of course, to be resilient in the situation, but also thinking about building that muscle.
Yeah. Listen, I fully agree. Most leaders look great when the sun is shining. And I think one of the things when we recruit, especially senior leaders, the conversations are not around all their accomplishments, because it's a given when you get to that point. When you're in the seat in front of me or one of my colleagues, it's because you've done very well in your career. So what the conversation is around is the scars on your back. What were the setbacks and how did you handle those? Because that's much more important to me than how did you achieve something when the wind was in your back.
Absolutely.
Well, that's really well said. So in addition to good values, good judgment, good performance, I think this is something that is it's critical. I know, Bob, that you're also building a much stronger muscle inside the McKinsey on leadership, and I think resilience probably also will be an important part in that, because as also Jacob said, you would like to have leaders that have been out there and also handle crisis before. So I think that's critical.
Maybe just I fully agree with Jacob on that, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. The one part I disagree is there are some leaders, even when the sun's shining, don't look so good. So there's only so much you can do, over time. But you do. So
I think you weathered it okay too. You know, that maybe the best background is to have been a former politician, because then you wake up every day with a new crisis, and you know that if you wake up in the morning with the TV crew in your garden, you know they're not there to celebrate your birthday.
That's probably true. You might just be blinded by the shine, Borja, coming back. But to this notion of the pathways in an organization, and maybe just to build on it, because I know you and I had talked about in Carlsberg this idea of giving people experiences from places that they didn't grow up in to learn new things and get familiar with the unknown. I do think there is something to both pathway and planned experiments to build resilience as a muscle in leaders over time. I also think increasingly there's also something perhaps earlier in the funnel around selection. And one of the processes that we're going through, we're privileged to get a lot of applications every year. We get about 1.4 million people applying to McKinsey every year around the world. And what it gives us is a unique data set. And one of the things that we've been applying our own analytics to are, what are some of the characteristics that help build future leaders? And we're learning some new things along the way that actually hearken to resilience. One of the things that we realized was we had a bias to phenomenal performance throughout your life. The person who scored top marks all the way through. We had a bias for that. Well, guess what? It turns out that the person who's going to be a more successful leader is the person who had a setback and got back up from it. So what we're starting to look for now is these disruptions in your path. And what did you learn from that, and how did you pick up? So I wonder, to the point we were talking about, there may be pathways once somebody joins an organization, but there might also be some selection criteria as we think about the kind of people that we want to bring into our organizations. That may be something that we could explore together.
I think this is also a cultural thing. I think in the US, though, is more accepted in the American culture, maybe, that if you have failed and if you have had a bankruptcy, as long as you've been sticking to the law, it doesn't mean that you cannot be a future leader. But I do wonder when more than 1 million young people then apply for jobs at the McKinsey, how it in the current system comes out if you have been in trouble and then done well. Maybe you're not among the 10,000 that will be offered a job. Have you changed that system already?
We have. We've changed the criteria. And by the way, this is where technology helps, because we realized that as humans, we had bias in the selection process. You know, we were biased to the name of the institution that you went to, right? We had bias around looking for that perfection. And by the way, if you use the buzzword of the day, you know, generative AI, and you kind of look at, you actually start to debias, and you start to learn what some of these predictive markers are. And so my only point is, I think there's a wonderful opportunity as we think about talent to potentially move from some form of credential approach to much more potential. And I think one of the potential aspects is this notion of resilience and this idea of what have you learned along the way from your journey, even if your journey is bumpy. In fact, maybe we want your journey to be bumpy because you actually learn more as a leader there. I think there's an interesting field in that. Yeah?
No, I have a bit of a problem to make a segue from this.
Sorry.
into I'm supposed to ask you a question related to macroeconomic resilience in emerging markets. So,
I like how we took Borge off his script.
So you can feel free to comment on this leadership piece, because I think a lot of people are applying for jobs at the IMF too. But I do think, though, I do think that it is incredibly important now to also how we invest in future talents and innovations in emerging markets. And so feel free to help me.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I would just follow up on what both of you said was, it would be very helpful if you, by the way, communicate or televise this to our young folks, that this has changed the way you recruit. And, you know, you said it's not about credentials, but it's about what?
Potential.
Potential. Because we have a very anxious generation that we have right now. And they're, of course, anxious for multiple different reasons. But it would help if they knew that even if, you know, they had a setback, you know, companies like yours have learned something in the past few years and have figured that that's actually a positive. So please put that out there.
And we are televising this.
Yes, indeed,
for
exactly.
millions.
But get it out to more and more young people.
So.
Yeah.
So yes, I think what is absolutely critical for emerging markets, like I said, an important fact is private investment, domestic private investment, has slowed over the last 2 decades across emerging markets. I guess an important exception like Saudi Arabia. But that is not great, because you cannot have growth. Your potential growth is going to be weak if you don't have private investment. The other trend that is troubling is if you look at foreign capital inflows into emerging and developing countries, that has also slowed over the last 25 years. If you look at foreign direct investment, that has slowed over the last 25 years. So clearly, finance is not looking at these countries and saying, these are big growth opportunities that we need to be investing in. Again, with exceptions, but that's the general trend. And that has to change, and that can change with good policies, several of which were mentioned over here, in terms of you know, showing that you're now doing the reforms that are needed to attract investment, that this is an opportune place to put your money in. It's also very important to ensure that you have the skilled labor force that's keeping up with all the technological developments. One of the things we are concerned about, which can further exacerbate a divergence between advanced economies and emerging markets, is the fact that, it is AI and the new technologies, which, if you look at the numbers in terms of, 60% of advanced economy jobs are exposed to AI. And if you go down to low-income countries, that number is 26%. Exposure, it can be both good and bad. But since there's a very important good part to it, the fact that they will be able to increase their productivity through the use of this technology is very important. And there is no simple way for us to see how that gets transferred to many of the developing countries. How can they use it? They're going to have to build their digital infrastructures. They're going to have to build their human capital and skills. And the other thing that I want to mention for resilience is, while there is a lot of money going into climate mitigation, there is much less going into climate adaptation. So close to 90% of climate finance is for mitigation purposes. Very, very little is for adaptation purposes. And for many emerging and developing countries, it is adaptation that requires the most amount of money. So how do we turn that into something that the private sector sees as an investment opportunity? They don't see it right now as such. Governments are being relied on to do it. So how do they turn that into it? How do institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the other institutions help de-risk some of this kind of investment and be able to attract more capital? So there are very specific needs that emerging markets have that we need to focus on and make sure that they're getting the finance and they're getting the technology that they need to have a ramp up in productivity growth.
No, you're so right. And on the adaptation piece, it's not only in developing or emerging markets. I think even in very developed countries, there can be empty reservoirs for water and all this. So faced with natural disasters. So we have now 3 minutes left and we have 3 speakers. So I'll try to square that circle. Coming to you, Mr. Al-Jadaan, you heard about what Jita also just said related to investments and FDIs in emerging markets. And Saudi is in a situation where you do invest a lot. So you do have capital. You have one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. When you make those decisions, do you have a bias also towards supporting emerging markets, or is it just where you expect the short-term best return on your investments?
I think both, but I'll come back to this. But quickly, I think in relation to leadership, it's not only leadership in corporates, it's also leadership in governments. And I absolutely agree that the leadership with experiences of really going through tough times and actually making bad decisions are likely to bounce back and become better leaders. In relation to investments, we invest across the world, but we also have a very specific designed, actually, investments in emerging markets to support emerging markets, but then make returns. So it's not, the investment part is not about development funds, it's actually to make returns, but it is actually designed for emerging markets, and we have a lot of investments in multiple emerging economies, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Jordan, Bahrain, and a few other areas, in actually Ukraine and Argentina. But then the key part of that investment is actually to look for sectors that will ultimately benefit Saudi Arabia. Even if we are investing in the US or in China or in Europe, it's really what's in it for Saudi Arabia. Are we going to bring a know-how? Are we going to attract?
That's the mantra of the day now, isn't it? Like every country is now looking at how to make your country great.
Well, I'm happy, I'm thankful, I'm grateful, but it comes with a lot of efforts. And if you make the right efforts, I think you will get the right investments, even in your own country.
So I think building on that, Odia, what we're trying to look at is when is there overlap in the national interests? And then you can also make and secure collaboration. I think one has to have much more of a real political approach when these national interests are like what they are, but there's also a lot of overlap, and there I think you can strike and make deals for collaboration.
Probably that's part of the new reality,
Yeah.
I guess, and it's addressed. I mean, it has always been a reality that you have some overlap and some. I was thinking that one of the key message I think that I would like to get through is that diversification also for international investors and diversification in investing in emerging economy is a way to improve the resilience, because then you have, different opportunities, you open up different, and so that should be something that should be better reflected. I think we have a bit also of regulatory issues and how we create incentive for investment in the emerging market.
Jacob, 1 minute, you can sum up. Yeah, no, listen, I think that debate is the right one. So on that topic, I think spot on. Actually, from both of you, it's from our perspective, private-public partnerships are so important when we work with emerging markets, especially on not climate mitigation, but climate adaptation. That's where we found the formula, but it's incredibly hard work in terms of stakeholder management, getting the right institutions involved, and creating the greater why around it. At another session, I would love to talk about some of the work we've been doing in Laos, in West Africa, etc. It's some fantastic projects where we managed to combine public research funds, our own experts from the central laboratories, together with local business and agriculture, creating regenerative farming in Laos, saving significant amounts of water, creating new livelihoods for farmers, creating new livelihoods for farmers in West Africa by introducing a new grain, fonio, a climate-resistant crop, into our product instead of your traditional products, etc. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity out there, but these are the hard yards. It's incredibly hard work right now, getting coalitions together, getting stakeholders together across. But it's work that needs to be done. So we can move the needle in terms of moving to adaptation, because we're not just there to mitigate. We're actually, back to my first answer earlier, this is about being on the offensive. So let's be adapting instead of mitigating as we go along.
Thank you. Thank you to a great panel. I found this a fascinating discussion. So thank you for your leadership in the field of resilience too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.